What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm going to walk you through the display properties panel inside of Oxygen. I've gotten a lot of emails. I've seen a lot of people asking questions in the Oxygen community about the different types of display properties: Flex, Block, Inline-Block, Inline-Flex. What do these mean? What do they do? And I do want to point out that this isn't just like a fundamentals video for beginners. If you are experienced with building websites or CSS, even advanced perhaps, it's probably a good video for you to watch, because here's the thing, and I think this adds to the confusion that a lot of people experience. These display properties inside of Oxygen do not behave the same as when you use them in the real world. For example, if you were just coding a website and writing CSS from scratch, the display properties behave one way, and then when you go into Oxygen, they behave a different way. And I'm going to explain why that is, and we're going to go over what those quirks actually are, so that by the end of this video, you will have a really solid understanding of what all the display properties are and how they work and how they behave uniquely inside of Oxygen, or really why when you click a certain display property, it doesn't do what you expect it to do. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to screen share. Got the training site pulled up here. All right, with a little editing magic, we now have a, I didn't want you guys to have to watch me just do, nonsense, which is building a section for each part of this tutorial. So I cut, and here we are, back ready for action. So first thing I want to do, we're going to just click on this first section, go to Advanced, go to Layout, and then I want you to just look at the display properties that are available to you. You have 4 basic display properties. You have 3 advanced display properties. The basics are Block, which is right here, Inline-Block, Inline, and None. And then the advanced display properties are Flex, Inline-Flex, and Grid. One really important thing to note is that when you're using the basic display properties, you apply those to individual elements. So if you want to manipulate that individual element, you apply the display property to it. If you're using the advanced display properties like Flex, Inline-Flex, and Grid, those are applied to containers of elements, right? If you have like 6 images and you want to make them into a grid, you don't apply display grid to each image. You put the images in a container and you put display grid on the container. The same thing is with Flexbox, right? If you want to align items inside of a container, you put the flex rules on the container. Now, you can certainly do, you can override the Flexbox controls or the grid controls at the item level, but primarily when using those advanced display properties, you're definitely starting at the container level, versus with the basics, it's applied to individual elements only. So let's take a look at display block, since that's the easiest. And in fact, a lot of elements in CSS are display block by default. For example, a heading. This is a heading right here, and it is display block by default, except in Oxygen. So we have to immediately get into the conversation of, here's how things work in the real world, and here's how things work in Oxygen world. And so if you take a look at a heading, I'll just show you right now, we're going to do a background color. So I'm going to put a background color on here, and let's do blue. Let's just do something super ridiculous and ugly. So there is a blue background. Now, if this heading were truly display block, even though the text doesn't go all the way across the screen, that blue background would go all the way across the screen. Things are blocked by default because there needs to be a natural stacking order. Certain elements are expected to stack on top of each other. If I duplicated this heading, I would not want this heading to be next to this other heading, right? You don't typically put a heading next to another heading. You put a heading and then another heading below it, like an H2, and then an H3, and then an H4. So those are block level elements. Paragraphs are block level elements. You don't have paragraphs next to each other unless you force them to do that. But naturally, a paragraph should come before another paragraph, or a paragraph should come after another paragraph all the way down the page. And if you have headings in there, it's headings, paragraph, paragraph, heading, paragraph. These things don't go next to each other. They're not in line naturally. Naturally, they should flow on top of each other. That's basically what display block does. Display block, a block level element, takes up all the available space across so that another item will automatically and always go below it unless you change from display block to something else. But the natural order is display block. In Oxygen, you see that that is clearly not happening. And in fact, if I go to this heading and I go to layout and I force it to be a block, it will not become display block. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and take a look at this on the front end so that we can inspect the code, because I do think there's something important there for us to learn. So we're going to go to the front and we're going to right click on this heading, and you can see that it's an H2. You can see right here that it is set to display block. This is not a rule that's being overwritten by any other rule. In fact, if I put important on it, which is supposed to force this thing to do what I'm telling it to do at all costs, it's still not doing anything. And here's the reason. When you add a section in Oxygen or a div, this even happens to blank divs in Oxygen, Oxygen sets the display of that container to flex. Now remember, I said advanced CSS display properties like Flexbox manipulate their child elements. So these headings, because they're in a container that is set to display flex, are being manipulated. They are not allowed to be displayed block, right? They actually behave as if they're display inline block, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you wanted them to display block, and you're going to see in a minute, we're going to run into this issue when we try to use display inline and display inline block, same issues caused by Oxygen. Now, I will say that some people do see this as a benefit, but, and I don't think there's necessarily a pro or con either way. You just have to know what's happening. Because if you don't know what's happening, that's where you're going to get really frustrated. Because things are just not going to behave the way you would expect them to behave. And if you're coming from another builder that doesn't set display flex by default, or you're coming from writing your own code and you're used to things behaving the way they're supposed to behave in CSS, and you come to Oxygen, then yeah, you're going to get confused, you're going to get frustrated, you're not going to know what's going on, or it's at least it's going to take you some investigation, and that's a bunch of wasted time, obviously. So the reason these things again are not behaving as we intend them to behave is if we click on this CT section inner wrap, which is the div inside of a section. Oxygen section is actually two elements. It's the section wrapper itself, and then there's an inner div inside of it. You'll hear people complain about that. That is, in my opinion, proper HTML structure for creating sections. So no problem with that whatsoever. It's how it is supposed to be. But this inner wrap is in fact set to display flex, and the flex direction is column, which also goes against standard defaults. The default for display flex is actually row. And you'll see these are trying to go side by side, but they're not quite making it there. But if we put the flex direction of column back active again, you'll see that this is the default inside of Oxygen. So what we have to do if we want these elements to behave as display block, which is what we're telling them to do, we have to reset this section back to its what should be its default or its natural state, which is block itself. All right, so I'm going to click on the section here. I'm going to go to layout and I'm going to go to block. Now you see these are actually behaving like block level elements. This is exactly what a block level element does. It takes up the entire width of the available space. Now you're probably saying to yourself, Kevin, you just told me that basic display properties don't get assigned to the parent. And you're right. And this is not a contradiction. We're only assigning block to the parent because it was previously assigned something else. It was not allowed to be its default state. Block is supposed to be its default state. So we're just resetting it back to its default state. We're not adding any manipulation to it, right? If we were adding manipulation, it would be we're adding grid or we're adding flex, and that's what Oxygen does by default. It adds manipulation. We're just getting rid of the manipulation. Now it's back to what it was supposed to be in the very beginning, and now you can see the elements inside of that section are actually behaving as intended. Display block takes up all the available space, and everything will stack underneath it. So the next one we're going to move on to is display inline. So we're going to take two block level elements and we are going to make them appear side by side. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a div. So this div is going to contain our two elements, and we're going to set these elements to display inline. So we can do this with links. Now, links in CSS are display inline by default. They should, if you put two links side by side, and in fact, whoops, not Code Academy. That is an amazing site, by the way. Codepin.io is where I will go to prove this to you. And I'm just going to do an href. And here we go. And this is a link. And then I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to paste it. And we're going to see what the output is. Two links side by side because links by default are display inline. This makes perfect sense, by the way. If you're writing a paragraph of text, this is my text, this is my link, and there's my end of my paragraph. And then I'm just going to grab that real quick. This is my link. Okay. You can't force a link inside a paragraph to a new line. It's going to completely break how the paragraph behaves, right? So these are naturally inline. The reason I am using links as an example for display inline, even though they're inline by default, is because we're going to run into another Oxygen-caused issue with this display flex rule. So I'm going to add a link, just a text link, and this is my link. Now, if I duplicated this link, and we were doing this in the real world, not in Oxygen, the next link would show up beside this link, except it doesn't in Oxygen. They appear one on top of the other. You just saw in CodePen that this is what's supposed to happen right here. In Oxygen, this is what's happening right here. And again, this is where I say people get confused. They're used to how things work in the real world. They're not really working that way in Oxygen. And then someone's like, okay, well, let's go force them to be side by side. So they go to advanced, they go to layout, they click inline. And then they go to this one. They're like, oh, that didn't work. Let me do it on this one too, just to make sure. Inline. Nothing is happening. So we're going to hit save. We're going to go back to the front end. And we're going to take a look at what is going on here. So I am going to inspect. I can see that let's go into this div. Here's my two links right here. And I can see over here that they are in fact set to display inline, but they are not displaying inline. Why is that? Because just like sections, a div in Oxygen has display flex direction column. The flex is overriding what the individual elements are trying to do, and it's governing them. It's telling them, hey, no, you're supposed to display as a column. Everything in this container is supposed to display in a column. That is what Oxygen is telling it to do by default. So how do we fix this? How do we make these links behave and actually be inline? And you could be doing the same thing with buttons. It doesn't really matter what the elements are. You have to override that default flex. You have to put display block on your container, something you normally would not have to do because a div is a block level element by default, except in Oxygen where it's not a block level element by default. So we have to set this to block. And immediately when I do that, the elements inside start following their own rules, which at this point, you don't even need the display inline. Because remember, I told you links are display inline by default. So there we have display inline. Now, display inline does have some problems. So let's do a button, because this is one of those situations where a lot of people are like, how do I get side-by-side buttons? And I'm not saying that this is the way to do it, okay? There are better ways to do it than this, but it's a good example because it's going to break. And I want you to see it break so that we can fix it. And you can see the difference because this is going to take us right into the next one. So I will duplicate that. There's my two buttons side by side. So this is going to be button number 1. This is going to be button number 2. Okay, perfect. And then let's see if these have, okay, this is set to layout block. And then I want to layout inline. There you go, layout inline. Okay, those are still being, I had to force them to be inline even though they're technically inline by default because Oxygen is still, there's an inheritance issue going on where it's still inheriting some of the flex properties. So setting it to inline is exactly what we are getting at now. Now I don't know if I can, yeah, I can. Can you all see that border? The buttons, because they're display inline, are now disrespecting the div. They're actually flowing outside of the div. They're breaking the div. And this is because they have padding, but the div isn't recognizing that because that's how inline works. And if I now say, well, I want this to be that 30 rem or whatever we were going to do, notice I cannot set a width. I cannot set a height. I can't do anything to these buttons because they're inline, and that's how inline works. So that's going to bring us into our next one below. Let me zoom out. That's crazy. Okay. So I'm going to take that div with my inline buttons and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to drag it down into display inline block. So here's the difference between inline and inline block. An inline block element behaves like a block element, except for the fact that it can be inline, right? So if I change these buttons, so I go to layout, instead of inline, we choose inline block. Look, now the div is able to, like, it's respecting the div, okay? So now I go to inline block, boom. Or the div is able to wrap itself successfully around the buttons. I don't know the best way to explain that to you. But now, because it's inline block, they're still inline. They're still side by side. However, watch this. I can now manipulate them. I can do whatever I want in terms of their dimensions, and everything around them will be influenced by that. Whereas when I was on inline, I couldn't do any of that. So inline block gives you block abilities, but also allows things to be in line with one another, okay? Where remember, typical display block, it forces everything below. It forces everything to the next line. All right, so that is inline blocks. We've gotten 3 of our basics out of the way. All right, the next one is display none. This one is super easy, but there is a little point of confusion in here for some people. So I'm going to add 2 different buttons. This one is going to be called display none. This one is going to be called visibility hidden. And then I'm going to add one more button. Let's just duplicate. And then this one is going to be called button, just like that. So display none, we're going to go to advanced layout, display none. It makes it disappear, okay? We're going to go visibility hidden. We're going to go to advanced layout. Under visibility, we're going to choose hidden. Now, what is the difference that you just saw between those 2 properties? The display none disappeared and the space that it was taking up disappeared also. With visibility hidden, the button disappeared, but the space is still reserved. And if we look at the front end code, let me get our front end here. So if we actually look at the code, inspect, open our div, we see that display none is grayed out, which means it doesn't actually exist, but DevTools is telling me that it's there. And then the one that's visibility hidden, in fact, you can see it right there. It tries to highlight it on the page. It is not grayed out. It is still there. It's just not visible. That is the big difference between display none and visibility hidden. You don't want to use visibility hidden when you really want something to be gone. If you just want it to be not visible, that's when you use visibility hidden. If you want it to actually be gone, then display none is the appropriate thing to use. So that's just that's easy. It's basics, it's fundamentals, but there is a quick caveat there. All right, let's move on to display flex. Now, Flexbox is super advanced. I'm not going to go into advanced Flexbox controls, but I do want you to be familiar with Flexbox, and I want to encourage you to play a little bit of a game with Flexbox so that you can learn it a little bit better. But I'll go over the basics. So first thing I'm going to do, just so we have more real estate here, is I'm going to put a height 70 class on this container, and that's going to give us room to work with our Flexbox. So right now I'm going to display flex, have this heading. You can see by default, it's in the top left corner. Let me remind you that Oxygen sets sections to display flex by default. So we don't actually have to do anything to get display flex. It's already there by default. But if you go to layout and then you choose flex and you choose column and you choose flex start for justify, that would be the default right there. And as you can see, I just clicked 3 buttons and nothing happened because all I did was just mirror what's already the default. So here we go. Layout or Flexbox versus grid when it comes to layouts. If you want to position items on a page or in a container, just control their position, where they are, how they interact with each other. Flexbox, really powerful, really, really powerful. In fact, when we did the inline buttons up top, you remember that? Flexbox would be really great for that. Of course, you can also use grid. Grid is best when you need elements to be laid out in an even grid. Now, the grid doesn't have to be even. We're not going to get into the advanced aspects of grid either. But if you need column-based layouts, if you need grid-based layouts, then CSS Grid is the way to go. If you're positioning actual elements inside of a container, that's where you're going to want to be using Flexbox. That's, again, that's just the dumbed down way to do it, okay? The way to explain it. So let's start with the 4 corners, what I call like the 4 corners game, which is we have to make this heading right here touch all 4 corners, or like move from corner to corner so that we can practice our Flexbox controls. So let's take a look at justify first. And I will say this right off of the bat. Flexbox, whoever created it, did an absolutely awful job of naming how these things behave. We have the 2 main things that you're going to want to pay attention to are align items and justify content. Now, in my opinion, this should be align content and justify content, or align items and justify items. Make them have the same terms, okay? They don't. One's called align items and one called justify content, because down here you see align content, and now everybody's super confused. You're going to be more confused by the fact that justify means something different depending on the primary axis of the flex. Okay, so let's go to the axis topic. We have 2 different axes to work with. You have a column axis up and down. You have a row axis side to side. And you need to set a primary axis when you're using Flexbox. Column in Oxygen is the default. Row is the default in the real world. Okay, so that's another point of confusion. So column is the default inside of Oxygen. We're going to stick with column for right now. When you are trying to move things along the primary axis, you need to use justify. Okay, so that's justify content, moves items along the primary axis. So I will show you. Flex end. Where is the end of the primary axis? Well, it's a column. So the end of the primary axis is right here. So if I hit flex end, it moves to right there. It moves to the end of the primary axis. Now I'm going to make it go back to the start. Now watch this. I'm going to change the primary axis to row. So where is flex end now? Flex end now is this corner, the end of the new primary axis, which is row. So if I hit flex end on the same control, I'm not using align content instead. I'm not doing align items. I'm still using justify. The same thing I did before. Remember flex end a minute ago made this come down here. Now it's going to make it go over there. Justify follows the primary axis. Align items follows the alternate axis. So we're going to take a look at how that works. But you can see now why the confusion really comes in. Justify content is the primary axis. Align items is the secondary axis. The 2 axes should have the same terminology. Don't you agree? Like, that's how I think it should be. So let's put it back to column. Let's put it back to flex start. All right. So again, justify primary axis. Let's make it go to the end. So if we want it over here without changing it to row, we can just use align items, flex end will now respect the secondary axis. Now, some people say use Flexbox if you only want control over one axis, but really Flexbox gives you control over both axes. So I don't like that description of Flexbox versus grid. Grid is a multi-axis display property as well, but in my opinion, so is Flex, because you have control over both axes in Flexbox. So some people will use that as the differentiator. I don't, because it's just not true. All right, so we have column. Let's go back to the beginning. So we have flex start. Okay, there we go. So if I wanted to go to this top right corner without changing it from column to row, how do I do that? I don't use justify because that's not the main axis. It's the secondary axis. So I use align. Flex end sends it all the way over to this corner. So you guys can play with making these items touch all four corners. Flex start. And then if I want to go down here, let's go flex start, justify content, flex end brings it down here. So I'm touching all four corners. Once you've done that, then you can start playing with center and center. So now you can see how justify moves it up and down. So now I'm vertically centering things, or vertically ending things, or vertically starting the content. Or I can bring it left to right using the align items axis, okay? So that's how columns versus row works in Flexbox. That's how align items and justify content work. Let's add more than one item now. So let's go, let's switch to an image. Again, this is just the basics of Flexbox, guys. This isn't even the advanced stuff. Okay, so we're going to select the image. Thank you. All right, let's go with 20 rim. So there's my image, and I'm going to duplicate it. Awesome. So now let's see how it behaves with two different elements inside. So if I switch that to row, obviously they are going to go side by side. Now let's take a look at why, because they actually should be layout, flex, row, flex start. Let's see why they're not. And this may be an Oxygen 4.0 thing, because in the other version of Oxygen, these do behave properly. All right, let's see what's going on here. Okay, what's this? This has a, oh, it's okay. It's because I have owl spacing on this container. Yeah, that will definitely mess things up. Okay, so now they are properly, sorry, it wasn't an Oxygen 4. Look, I jumped to like blaming Oxygen. I'm like, probably a 4.0 thing. All right, so here's our two elements side by side. Notice that as I play with their alignment, if I go, flex in, for example, they simply move together. Now, another couple properties here is space between and space around, which are super helpful. So you have space between, which will put those opposite of each other. And this is a justify property, which means it respects the primary axis. So if I change this from row, which it is right now, to column, take a guess. What's going to happen? This one is going to come down here. So I change it to column. There it is. Now they're apart from each other, but they're on the new axis, right? Because I'm using justify content. Space around brings them in just so it can have even space on the outside of the elements as well. And if I switch to row, the same thing would happen. It's going to leave gaps on the outside. Okay, so that's how this works with multiple items inside. Now let's set it back to flex start, and let's make a lot of items, because I want you to see how Flexbox actually will allow you to break a container. So I'm just going to duplicate this a lot, and you're going to see it goes completely off the edge of the screen. This will happen to you in multiple occasions when you're doing things in Oxygen. It may happen if you set a width on a div that has social icons in it, and you're using Flexbox, and you add too many social icons, it'll break out the side of the div. So I want you to know how to fix it, okay? There is a property with Flexbox called wrap, and you can choose whether items will wrap in a Flexbox container or not wrap in a Flexbox container. Obviously, the default here is not wrapping. So we have to go to advanced layout, and under Flex, let's see, down here with Flex wrap, you're going to see no wrap, wrap, reverse. So I'm going to click on wrap, and you're going to see that suddenly my whole problem is fixed, right? This does not break. I can't scroll left and right anymore. I act like you guys can see my finger going left to right on the mouse. I can't scroll left to right anymore. Everything is behaving as it normally would, except you do see a new problem when you wrap elements inside a Flexbox container. There seems to be a lot of space between these items. These items are not that tall, right? There is a giant gap here. And this is where we come into the align content properties. So the way that I think about align content is, in my mind, I translate it into align lines, because here's the thing. if I take off, let me delete these real quick. So I'm going to just delete a few of these, and I'm going to take off the wrap. There's a lot of confusing stuff with Flexbox. I'm going to take off the wrap. Now watch. Align content will do absolutely nothing. See? And people will do this and be like, what in the world? Like, what is this supposed to do? And you would think it would do something because justify content did something. Why wouldn't align content do something? Because align content only applies to multiple lines inside of Flexbox, with the caveat of if you put Flexbox wrap on here, it acts like there's multiple lines, and then suddenly this will start working. But really what this is typically for is because when you're wrapping content, let's go back to our wrapped lines. Well, you see it right there, okay? So layout, let's take off Flex Start. That's where we were a minute ago, where I said, see, there's a giant space between all of these images. That's where align content comes into play. So if you want the lines, all of the lines, to jump to the head of the container, the start of the container, you do Flex Start. Now that bottom line jumped up. Now all lines are forced to the top. If I do Flex End, all lines will be forced to the bottom of the Flex container. If I center them, they'll be forced to the center. If I do space around, I pretty much get what we had before. And then you can also do stretch, which doesn't really apply based on the structure of what we're doing here. So align content, again, in my mind, the reason I say align lines is because it also reminds me that it only works when there's multiple lines or when we're wrapping the Flexbox items. So that, hopefully that's helpful to you, but that's what align content does, even though justify content does something like totally different and works without wrap and all that good stuff. Okay, so I think that covers like the basics of Flexbox. I will say this, like get a blank container on a page and just play around with the Flexbox controls like I'm doing here. That's a lot better than just using Flex every now and then to problem solve while you're building websites. Like it'll actually teach you how this stuff behaves and the little caveats and intricacies of Flexbox. It's definitely worth doing. Like just spend 30 minutes and you'll be a lot more confident with how Flexbox works. Now let's come down and take a look at display inline flex. Like what in the world could that possibly mean? So in order to show you what inline flex is supposed to do, because I can't do it just because Oxygen, the display flex on the container is going to break this as well. So I'm going to set this to block. Okay, which, well, I guess I already did. I set them all to block by default just so we could have a clean slate. All right, so I'm going to go with a div. And notice that my div is full width because this is display block. And I'm going to put in 2 buttons. So we'll do button and we'll do button. And then I'm going to show you here, we're going to go to layout, display flex. Please, display flex. Thank you. And I'm going to choose row. And notice I said earlier, there's a better way to do side-by-side buttons. This actually is not my favorite way to do it, but this is definitely one of the primary ways to do it, the way I see a lot of people do it. But this puts your buttons side by side. Now, what if I duplicate this? And I actually wanted this group of buttons to be next to this group of buttons. Well, by default, display flex containers are a block level element. You can see it going all the way across, even though it is layout display flex. And so is this one. So they cannot possibly be side by side. And if I change them to inline, right, they lose their flex. So I don't have Flexbox controls anymore. So that's where inline flex comes into play. If I do inline flex, it now respects the flex. Here, hold on. We got to go inline flex row. There you go. Somehow it lost its row. I guess when I went to inline, it reset it all. So flex is a block level element. Inline flex is not. It's kind of like it's resetting it. It's kind of like the display block of the, wow, it's not letting me do inline flex and row. Ooh, is that a bug? Look at it. It's switching it back to flex. I can't do inline flex and row. Inline flex. You should be able to do inline flex row. In fact, let's confirm that. Inline flex row. Unless I'm mistaken. Let's see. Flex container inliner. Flex versus inline flex. This will tell you if there's any caveats. Flexbox example. Here you go. Code pin. Display flex, display inline. Look, there it is. There's rows of content next to each other. This is a bug in Oxygen 4.0. I'm using the beta. So, I mean, it stands to reason that there's bugs in beta. 100%, look at it, it switches it back. It's not letting me do. Okay, well, we can do it with column. It's okay. So I'm going to do Inline-Flex with a column. And then on this one, I'm going to do Inline-Flex layout, Inline-Flex with a column. And so you see, oh, what just happened? Oh, it switched it back. Oh, what's it doing? Column. Oh, yeah, when you click column, it switches it back to flex. Okay, yeah, I gotta report this bug. Okay, you can get there by doing Inline-Flex and then boom. Okay, so we now have two flex boxes side by side. That's what Inline-Flex is. Ignore the Oxygen bugs. I shouldn't have installed 4.0 beta before doing this tutorial, but nevertheless, here we are. It's because I really do like 4.0 a lot better than the old versions. So there you go. That is display Inline-Flex minus all of the bugs. Okay, let's move on to grid. And you guys have seen me do grid plenty of times, but I'm going to add a container here, and I'm going to do an image, not a class. I'm going to do an image, and I'm going to browse, and it's going to be this one. And come on, please add it. Please add it, thank you. Okay, and then we will do rem 30, and we're gonna do, wow, these are all new. Okay, why isn't it doing 30? That's not 30 rem on my image. With 30 rem, let me see, hold on. Primary, do I need like a, what's going on here? Image URL, there's the size right there. Why isn't that size drop down? They gave us new things with like object fit and aspect ratio, but they still haven't fixed this source set issue. Okay, anyway, I digress. Let's go full. And I'm going to browse. I'm going to choose the image again. And I'm going to add it. And then, okay, I cannot make this. Let's set this to block. What is this image doing? Size and spacing. 40 rem. What in the world? Is this another Oxygen 4.0 bug? Size and spacing 40 rem. Max width 40 rem. That's not doing anything either. Okay, I don't know what we're doing here. Okay. All right. I feel like just adding images should work. Let's just make them little, I guess. Okay. Let's add this in. All right, I'm going to choose my wrapper. What is it doing? I'm going to choose my wrapper. Oh, I put 40 rem on there. 40 rem. Was I on the... No, okay. I give up. All right, so on this, I'm going to hit display grid. And, oh, that's amazing. All right, and then we're going to make the column count 3, and then we're going to get rid of the minimum width, and there you go. So we have 3 images side by side in our grid, and if I continue to add images, I mean, it's going to continue building the same exact grid. That's what a grid layout does at the very base. Now, I already did a complete tutorial on display grid. I've used the grid builder. I've used grid utility classes. I would urge you to go watch one of those tutorials. I will probably do an advanced grid tutorial. That's probably going to be inside the inner circle. Advanced Flexbox tutorial will go inside the inner circle. This is all just covering the basics. Let's do a quick review here. We have display block, elements go all the way across the screen. Display inline, they go side by side, but you can't control their width, height, stuff like that. Display inline block displays block, it gives you the block properties, but at the same time, things can go side by side. So that's super powerful. Display none makes things disappear. Visibility hidden makes them disappear, but they're still actually there. Key difference there. And then Flexbox We saw all of our different Flexbox controls, and then Inline-Flex, you can put two flex boxes side by side, because normally they behave like block level elements, and then display grid obviously displays things in a nice, even, symmetrical grid. So that is the end. I hope you guys got a lot out of this video. I hope you better understand the display properties in Oxygen. I hope you have a better understanding of how things behave in Oxygen versus how they are supposed to behave in the real world. So that should clear up a lot of confusion. It should end a lot of frustration. You now know that, hey, if I want things inside my containers to behave like I'm telling them to behave, I may need to set that container to display block so that I can get rid of the flex that's on it by default thanks to Oxygen. And then we got to see some Oxygen 4.0 beta bugs too. So that's awesome. If you loved this video, hit like, hit subscribe, drop a comment down below. If you have any questions, drop those for me as well, and I will cover them in a future tutorial. All right, guys, that's it for me today. I am out. Peace.